I strongly support the motion that the Honourable Jing Lee has brought here and recognise that multiculturalism and diversity are some of our state's greatest strengths and that the valuable contributions of our multicultural communities shape the social, cultural and economic development of our state. Indeed, I also stand in solidarity with our diverse communities and note that the neo-Nazi rhetoric and rallies that were a hallmark of the March for Australia demonstrations have caused distress, division, fear and harm, especially for migrant communities. I would also say in that though, and for First Nations communities, some of whom have questioned how a March for Australia is not inclusive of them, and indeed in some ways have reappropriated the Aboriginal flag, and that has been called out by First Nations Australians as for what it is, which is a sham. Those March for Australia rallies around the nation, of course, were at first marked by a lack of awareness about what they were all about and who was really organising them. But then, surprise, surprise, at each and every March for Australia rally right across the nation, neo-Nazis were involved, not just attending, but speaking at those rallies. So for those who simply wanted a day out to celebrate being Australian, if you stand with neo-Nazis, I do not stand with you and I do not support that action. There are much better ways you can stand for the things that Australia should rightly hold proud than to stand next to or shoulder to shoulder with neo-Nazis. Around those March for Australia rallies, Mr. President, I did observe a fear in our community and in community members, particularly from the Indian community, actually, particularly from the Indian community. I have a friend who is a rideshare driver. He is not Indian, but he posted online that his Indian colleagues were scared to work that day, were confused about what those rallies were about, and were worried for their safety. Ironically, of course, many of them also reported taking people to those rallies, to attend those rallies. And as we know, there's the infamous picture of some rally attendees then going to a Chinese restaurant afterwards with their Australia flags draped over their shoulders as they tucked into, no doubt, a delicious, succulent Chinese meal. The irony, I think, however, is lost on them. And perhaps they didn't really know they were marching with neo-Nazis. And I do hold hope that not all who marched are actually racist, but I also urge them to reassess who they marched with and what really is the intent here. And I think the intent of these March for Australia rallies is to divide us, and to divide us along the lines of ethnicity and race to other members of our community, to claim some are more Australian than others, and to create the sort of horrific scenes we saw in Cronulla not that long ago. I never want to see those sorts of scenes repeated, and I so will stand today and affirm my commitment to our diverse communities in this country, to First Nations Australians, to the first and the last Australians, as they often say, who often get treated the worst in our society. And when they get treated the worst, that is usually because of racism. I do believe that the member has really valid points here in terms of calling on the Australian government, but I also want to just review and take this opportunity to reflect on the Everyday Racism report that the former Commissioner for Children and Young People, Helen Connolly, produced in May 2024. And she was actually surprised at the time and produced that report where she'd consulted with South Australian children and young people, and she found that the cruelty of the racism reported to her by South Australian young people from migrant communities prevalent and to her surprise and shock. We know, of course, that racism-based bullying is a learned behaviour and that it tends to increase as young people make their way through the school system and peaks in the senior years of school. But it's not just young people, of course, who are exposed to racism. It's at school, in our work settings, and in social settings too. Whether overt or covert, indirect or direct, we need to address the unpalatable fact that racism is a behaviour that is being practised right around us. And we have to change this. And our children and young people already have enough challenges to deal with without racism on top of it. The 2017 Multicultural Youth Australia Census found that 49% of 15 to 25-year-olds from migrant backgrounds had experienced discrimination or unfair treatment in one form or another in the previous 12 months. Well, pretty much half of them. 67% of this same group of young people had experienced racial discrimination at some point in their lives. Not only does racism undermine a person's sense of belonging and their developing identity, their sense of self, but it undermines their relationships too. If there are not already enough harms, racism can be a barrier to education, employment, and full participation in our society and our community. Barriers that prevent access to these fundamental parts of being a human being lead to exclusion and marginalisation, and they come from that othering that I mentioned before. And that can see students leaving school early, ruling out going to university or further tertiary study, not taking up certain courses, and ultimately seeing young people from migrant backgrounds miss out on those critical everyday role models to whom they can relate and who can understand their experiences. Even those of us who don't necessarily suffer racism directly can, of course, suffer from its consequences. Vicarious racism can lead to increased childhood illness and social and emotional difficulties. And the impacts of racism can be insidious in how they manifest. Racism can, of course, lead to really long-term intergenerational consequences. The United Nations Commission on the Rights of the Child, the Federal Racial Discrimination Act, and at a state level, the Equal Opportunity Act and the Racial Vilification Act all seek to ensure that racism does not have a place in our communities, and rightly so, and that everyone is protected from it. These pieces of legislation demonstrate the desire of previous parliaments and our South Australian community to bring an end to this abhorrent behaviour. Events such as the March for Australia undo that work, but we will stand against it. It's time we recognise that legislation, of course, alone is insufficient. We must ensure that our institutions and our communities embody the intent of our legislation. The recent increased racism that is currently occurring across communities, in schools and in workplaces, is impacting our young people. The Commissioner recommended through the Everyday Racism report that the recommendations of her report be implemented as soon as possible. And these would aim to ensure a zero tolerance approach to racism as standard practice, empower students and teachers to call out racism without fear of retribution, empower sporting clubs to implement principles of non-discrimination, ensuring that children and young people from refugee and migrant backgrounds can fully participate in sport without compromising their psychological safety, and to provide mentoring and work experience programs so that young people can build professional skills and healthy employer relationships. A commitment to wipe out racism is simply to treat everybody with the same level of dignity and respect that we would like ourselves to be treated with. The recommendations in the Commissioner's report are yet to be implemented, I believe, and I also look to the good work of Reconciliation SA, which has discovered that First Nations Australians are extraordinarily likely to feel that racism exists and to experience racism in their lives. More than 1 in 2 of those people in that study reported experiencing direct racism. We are not doing enough. We can do more. And so with that, I do congratulate the Honourable Jing Lee for her leadership, not just in this motion, but in this place and in her communities. I know that she is very well respected within multicultural communities and has worked incredibly diligently for some over 15 years now as a leader